Red Theory, Dialectics or Metaphysics, Two Methods of Analysis by J. Seitz. In our last article, we saw that Marxism-Leninism bases itself on a materialist worldview, but we saw, at the same time, that materialism as it became to be understood with the rise of bourgeois society was still metaphysical in its method of analysis. At this point, let's look at the difference between the metaphysical and dialectical method. Then we can better understand how Karl Marx established the philosophical basis of revolutionary science, dialectical materialism. Metaphysics is a subject of philosophy that really begins, at least in the West, with Aristotle in ancient Greece, and is intended to look at that which lies beyond the senses, or outside the realm of perceptual experience. Friedrich Engels, in his book Ludwig Feuerbach and The End of Classical German Philosophy, calls metaphysics the old method of investigation and thought, which preferred to investigate things as given, as fixed and stable, a method the relics of which still strongly haunt people's minds. This might seem very abstract, but actually we encounter metaphysical thinking all the time, haunting people's minds in our movements and forming the basis of all kinds of blind alleys, strategic and tactical missteps, and opportunistic tendencies. For example, reformist thinking is based on a view that social progress can be a process of peaceful, quantitative growth, and that no qualitative leap is necessary. This is the view of both bourgeois liberals and the so-called democratic socialists. At the same time, reactionaries of all stripes believe that nothing can, or should, fundamentally change. We encounter lots of folks who peddle the idea that things are the way they are just by accident, rather than as the result of a historical process that brought us to where we are, therefore obscuring the root causes of the current state of things. And of course, many people don't understand how internal contradictions drive a given process, and thus find themselves unable to navigate these contradictions as they unfold. The dialectical method sweeps aside metaphysical thinking on all of these points and gives us the tools we need to combat it. Engels goes into all of this at length in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. To the metaphysician, things in their mental reflexes, ideas, are isolated, are to be considered one after the other and apart from each other, are objects of investigation fixed, rigid, given once for all. He thinks of absolute irreconcilable antithesis. For him, a thing either exists or does not exist. A thing cannot at the same time be itself and something else. Positive and negative absolutely exclude one another. Cause and effect stand in rigid antithesis, one to the other. Engels goes on to say that dialectics, on the other hand, comprehends things in their representations, ideas, in their essential connection, concatenation, motion, origin, and ending. We see then that metaphysical materialism stops short of seeing how contradictory forces, both within and without, can change a given thing and even cause things to transform into their opposite. It ignores how matter and ideas affect one another, and indeed can transform into one another, for ideas can become a material force in history when taken up by the masses. We have already seen how this works in our previous articles on the Marxist theory of knowledge in the mass line. Marxist-Leninist epistemology is not only materialist, but is fundamentally dialectical. So much for metaphysics. Let's look more closely at dialectics. Like metaphysics, dialectics too has its root in ancient philosophy. Socrates and Plato were both famous for their dialectical method. They believed that when two contradictory arguments were set against each other, reason could allow for a higher understanding to be reached. Later, the German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel took this idea further in developing his philosophy of dialectical materialism. It was Hegel who first systematized the dialectic. To put it as simply as possible, Hegel argued that there was a dialectical process of historical progression towards reason, where one thing is contradicted by another, leading to their sublation, or overcoming. Often this is described in terms of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, with the synthesis carrying forward some remainder as the thesis and antithesis are both overcome in something qualitatively new. Marx and Engels understood that within Hegel's dense, idealist system, there was an important key to understanding historical and social change. Hegel understood contradiction to be inherent to progress. Marx took the Hegelian dialectic and put it on a materialist basis. With him, it is standing on its head, it must be turned right side up again, if you would discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. The materialist inversion of the Hegelian dialectic means that Marx and Engels started with the material conditions of human beings as they worked to satisfy their material needs. Human society, they saw, has always been organized around its tools and the productive relations arising from that. From that, they understood the historical development of classes and of class struggle as the motive force of history. They illuminated how classes and class struggle drive forth the contradictions in any given historical period, leading towards revolution and advancement towards a new and higher stage, leading to new contradictions, ever onward. Finally, this brings us to another important point. It should be noted that Hegel's idealist dialectic is teleological, which means it has a fixed end or final cause that everything is being drawn towards. For Hegel, this is the actualization of God in the world through reason, the end of history. The materialist dialectic of Marxism has no such teleological end. From a dialectical materialist viewpoint, there is no reason to believe that there will ever be a time when all contradictions are resolved and there is no more struggle and thus no more progress. By applying the rational kernel of the Hegelian dialectic to modern materialism, the laws that govern social and historical change are finally revealed. Engels lists these laws of the dialectic as follows: the law of the unity and struggle of opposites, the law of the transformation of quantity into quality, and the negation of the negation. All of these may be summed up as particular aspects of dialectical contradiction. In our forthcoming articles, we will examine each of these in greater detail before advancing to an analysis of historical materialism, which is Marx's application of the materialist dialectic to history. Dialectics or Metaphysics, Two Methods of Analysis, by J. Sykes, published by Fightback News. Contradiction, The Kernel of Dialectics, by J. Sykes. Friedrich Engels lists 3 laws of dialectics, but, as we shall see, the most important is the law of contradiction, which he calls the law of the interpenetration of opposites. Before we discuss the other two, the transformation of quantity into quality and the negation of the negation, let's look closely at contradiction. Many of the great theorists of Marxism-Leninism wrote about dialectics in general and contradiction in particular. Mao Zedong extrapolated from the writings of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin, along with the direct experience of the Chinese Revolution, a systemic theory of materialist dialectics, particularly in his essay on contradiction. He was the first to explain dialectics in terms of the uneven development of contradictions, of principal and secondary contradictions, and, within that, of principal and secondary aspects of those contradictions. What, then, is a contradiction? When we talk about contradiction,
This is a guided meditation on peace, presentness, and political revolution. Find a place where you can sit comfortably, perhaps resting your hands on your knees. You may wish to sit on the floor with your legs crossed. Or, if you're not too tired, you may like to lie down on your back. Whatever position suits you. Make sure that your chest is open, and you may wish to allow your eyes to gently close, or find a point in the room where you can rest your focus. Begin by noticing your breathing. Feel your chest rising and falling, your belly expanding in notice also that society can be thought of as being made up of groups of people with conflicting and irreconcilable economic interests, which we call classes. You don't have to change society in this moment. This is your moment, your time. Just notice class conflict and be aware of it. This will be our anchor as we proceed on this journey. And now, let's take 3 deep, relaxing breaths. As you release the air in your lungs, you may wish to repeat in your mind the topics of today's meditation. And with each breath, I invite you to experience a doubling of your relaxation. Let's take the first of these 3 breaths now. Breathing in peace and out. Very good. Breathing normally in between, becoming even more relaxed with each breath. Let's take the second breath now. In presentness and release. Fantastic job. Aware of your chest rising and falling. Let's take the third and final breath now. Breathing in political revolution and out. Well done. Don't worry if your breathing doesn't match the sound of my voice. It is all good, and it is all okay. Just becoming even more aware of breath, and beginning slowly to relax. As we breathed those 3 relaxing breaths, you may have noticed a slight tingling sensation spreading from the top of your head down through your shoulders, arms, chest, right out the tips of your toes. This sensation is available to you throughout this meditation, whenever you desire. Don't be distressed or upset if you become distracted by thoughts or sounds in the room. Just keep coming back to breath. The world can be chaotic, and we can lose focus when we think about what we might like to change, or something we wish we could control. But just invite yourself to come back to breath and the model of class conflict. Breathing in and out. As you sink deeper and deeper into this relaxed state of awareness, you may begin to notice the position of your body, the surfaces you are in contact with, the temperature of the room. And you may also notice your body's position in the system of global capitalism. And the air continues to flow. next state. We are ready to consider the revolution. As you breathe in and out, receive an invitation to the idea that revolution will look different for you if you are in a bourgeois nation enriched by global capitalism than it might for someone in a country impoverished by it. Returning always to breath and class conflict. When we think about revolution, we may imagine it as destructive or violent. We may conjure images of past revolutions that we think fell short, or make jokes about sending landlords and capitalists to violent ends. We may shy away from this image, whether because we are liberals rather than socialists, or because we were raised in liberal capitalist societies that maintain a hold on our thoughts, or perhaps out of compassion and love for our fellow human beings, whoever they may be. Whatever the reason, we may desire to avoid revolution, but simply agitate for reform within capitalist society while maintaining its comforts. But although revolution means a break with the old ways of doing things, it need not be fundamentally destructive, but instead an act of creation. It may be scary or painful, like bringing a new child into the world, but it is the birthing of a new way of life, rather than the gradual managing of decay and bargaining with entropy that liberal democracy has become. This is not to say that we cannot learn from our mistakes or come to an understanding of history. Simply that, in considering the revolution, we want our focus to be on the present and not our anxieties about the past. Do not judge yourself if you have doubts. Simply observe them and let them go. We may become anxious or depressed when we ruminate on the past and witness the destruction and pain that can seem to surround us. We can be upset by the wickedness of others and wonder how it is that human beings can have done so many awful things to each other or the planet. Conversely, we may rejoice at small changes that we have managed to win in the past through elections and trade unions in the struggle for a fairer world. But the past is not real and exists only in our memories, in the present, where breath and class conflict remain, and where we want our focus to be. Breathing in, peace, and out. Each breath deepening your relaxation and your awareness. When we are not dwelling on the past, we often project our thoughts about revolution into the future, as if it will be some messianic event waiting just out of reach that will save us from the frightening things in our world. is only anticipation in the present moment. When we think of the revolution as a specific event, like an armed uprising that will take place in the future, we can become concerned about whether our actions take us closer to our idea of that event or farther away. We may become fixated on the purity of our vision, focusing only on the ideal, classless future, and neglecting other forms of oppression that others struggle against in the here and now. Or we may become anxious, thinking that it is an impossible task, or that we would have nothing to contribute, imagining instead that the future revolution will be led by anti-fascist catgirls or revolutionary daddies who will do the fighting for us. This can turn us against each other, or make us doubt ourselves, wondering whether what we or those around us are doing is truly revolutionary or merely reform. It is okay to have these doubts. Simply recognize them and return to the present moment, to breath, and the desire to abolish the class system. By noticing and letting go of doubts, and not judging ourselves or others for having them, we become prepared to take and wield power in the present, to neither retreat into ruminating on how we have been hurt in the past by the current political system, nor project our desire for change onto imaginary future heroes, but instead, in the present moment, to realize the energy inside of ourselves that we can use to lead the revolution. Now, breathing in presentness and out. When we look at the revolution either as a distant project of the future or the redemption of the past, we often imagine it as a moral crusade, springing from the best impulses of our hearts, and someday bringing about a lasting justice. But this way of thinking can also bind us and stop us from seeing the way forward in the present. It is easy to become overwhelmed or disappointed when our own sense of justice is not met, and to become concerned with how the resources of our world are distributed, rather than the conditions under which they are extracted and produced. We stray from the present and class conflict, and it is easy to conflate our moral desire for a better world with the ideals of participation in bourgeois democracies in which we are raised. That is not to say that we must abandon our moral ideals or close our hearts to democratic participation or the suffering of others, or that our smaller efforts to make the world a better place are necessarily a misuse of our time. It is merely to appreciate that a revolution is more than a change in the distribution of goods, or a struggle to get a slightly fairer deal. It is the struggle to abolish the causes of that injustice, not merely its symptoms, which are fleeting and can flare up chaotically. With your next breath, just invite any tense muscles to let go. In a moment, we will count backwards from 5 and gradually return to our normal awareness. But first, take a moment to suspend yourself in this relaxed state, as if deep in an ocean. The waves sway overhead, but you are still and calm. And now we will begin to surface with 5 short phrases. You may wish to repeat them in your mind or out loud, whatever is best for you. Beginning with 5. I am aware of my breath. 4. I am aware of my body, becoming more aware with each breath. 3. I am aware of class conflict, breathing in and out with 2. I am aware of the revolutionary energy inside me. And now, finally, 1. I embrace revolution in the present moment. Fantastic job. If you wish, you can stay in this relaxed state for as long as you desire. Or you may wish to continue your day renewed with this energy. Just remember to allow your awareness to always return to breath and the present moment, and the desire to abolish the class system. This meditation was written and performed by Oliver Thorne and recorded with the help of Man Brothers Media. Patreon.com/philosophytube is where you can support the show and find a list of the generous patrons who make it possible.
Red theory. We're talking about two opposing forces within any given concrete process? Contradiction is universal. The interaction of opposing forces takes place within all phenomena. Lenin said, the splitting in two of a single whole and the cognition of its contradictory parts is the essence of dialectics. Marx's great work, Capital, is an analysis of the particular contradictions at work, from top to bottom, within bourgeois society. Through looking at those contradictions, Marx was able to demonstrate the laws of motion that govern capitalist society. Capitalism is a complex process. Thus, in capitalism, there are many contradictions at work at the same time. There is the contradiction between the ruling class of exploiters, the bourgeoisie, and the class of exploited, the working class or proletariat. But capitalism also brings with it monopolies, imperialism, national oppression, and so on. There are numerous classes and social groups with their own interests and struggles. Even among the various strata of a particular class, there are different contradictions. But if we look closely at all of these contradictions, we find that capitalism is at the root of all of them. In his analysis of capitalism, Marx found that the basis of the class struggle within the capitalist mode of production is the contradiction between the social character of production and the private character of accumulation. Millions of people work in a complex division of labor to produce the wealth of society, while that wealth is accumulated in the hands of a small minority of people who own the means of production. In other words, production is social, but profit is private. This contradiction is the basis of the class struggle and the driving force behind the cycles of capitalist crisis. Mao says this contradiction is fundamental and points out that even as capitalism developed into its current stage, imperialism, this fundamental contradiction at the core of capitalism itself remained. As long as capitalism continues to exist, this fundamental contradiction continues to sharpen. The eventual resolution of this contradiction through proletarian revolution will mark the end of capitalism and the beginning of a new process, that of socialist construction. While the fundamental contradiction between social production and private accumulation is basic to what capitalism is, there are still many other contradictions at work in such a complex process, and these contradictions can play lesser or greater roles at different times and under different conditions. The principal or determining contradiction within that can also change, given the dynamics of the situation. Mao argues that, in capitalist society, the true forces in contradiction, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, form the principal contradiction. However, Mao argues that in national liberation wars against imperialism, the principal contradiction is different, as the class conflicts within that nation take a back seat to the struggle for liberation. We can expand or reduce the scope of our analysis to look at contradictions operating on a global scale, down to the contradictions operating on a very small, local scale. Currently, we live in the era of imperialism. Imperialism, led by the United States, strives to dominate the world politically, militarily, and economically, and the principal contradiction on a global scale is the contradiction between imperialism and the oppressed nations. To say that other contradictions are secondary isn't to diminish their importance, but rather to say that these contradictions are influenced and determined by the principal contradiction. We can't deal with principal or secondary contradictions if we don't know which is which. For this reason, Mao stressed that once this principal contradiction is grasped, all problems can be readily solved. Likewise, contradictions develop unevenly. In any given contradiction, one side of that contradiction is the principal or dominant aspect. The principal aspect of the contradiction is what plays the leading role within that contradiction, and the nature of a thing is determined by the aspect which plays this leading role. But the principal and secondary aspects also can exchange places. For example, in capitalist society, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat exist side by side, but the bourgeoisie plays the leading role. In socialist society, the proletariat will take over the leading role to dismantle capitalist productive relations and build socialism. So we see then that when the principal and secondary aspects of a contradiction exchange places, it causes a qualitative change in the situation. This understanding of how contradictions operate in complex processes gives us a deeper understanding of the laws of motion that govern that process. For this reason, dialectical materialism is a powerful tool for revolutionaries to break down a complex process and determine where and how to act. It is on the basis of this dialectical analysis of the terrain and struggle in the United States that we talk about a united front against monopoly capitalism. Under the leadership of the working class and its party, with the strategic alliance of the multinational working class and the movement of oppressed nationalities as its core, this is a strategy for revolution, based on the concrete analysis of our concrete conditions, which takes into account the complex matrix of principal and secondary contradictions, both within the imperialist United States and on a global scale. This method of analysis also functions on a tactical level, in particular on the ground struggles. We can use dialectical materialism to find the principal and secondary contradictions at work in a given struggle, such as in a union contract negotiation or in struggles against police brutality, and use that analysis to look at the interests of the different forces at work, how they interact, and where to aim our blows. In our next article, we will proceed to look more deeply at the identity and struggle of the aspects of a contradiction, and then at the question of the role played by antagonism in a contradiction. This will further help us to understand how to apply this method, especially when it comes to questions of different ways of handling contradictions between the masses and the enemy and contradictions among the masses of the people themselves. Contradiction, the Kernel of Dialectics, by J. Sykes, published by Fight Back News. On Identity and Antagonism and Contradiction, by J. Sykes. In our last article, we looked at some of the core concepts of dialectical materialism. We broke down the meaning of contradiction, and we looked at how contradictions develop unevenly in complex processes into principal and secondary contradictions. We also looked at how any given contradiction has its own principal and secondary aspects, with the principal aspect playing the dominant role. Now let's look more closely at identity and contradiction and the role of antagonism in resolving contradictions of different types. And on contradiction, Mao Zedong writes, in speaking of the identity of opposites in given contradictions, what we are referring to is real and concrete opposites, and the real and concrete transformations of opposites into one another. In one sense, identity means that the two aspects of a given contradiction are also contradictions for each other's existence. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without the proletariat, and vice versa. The class of exploiters depends entirely on the existence of a class of exploited from whom they draw their wealth and over whom they wield their power. Without the class of exploiters, the exploited too would not exist as a class. In this contradiction, the capitalist class plays the dominant role. They control the means of production, along with the superstructure of the state and its repressive and ideological apparatuses. However, the two aspects of this contradiction can exchange places. As Mao puts it, by means of revolution, the proletariat, at one time the ruled, is transformed into the ruler, while the bourgeoisie, the erstwhile ruler, is transformed into the ruled and changes its position to that originally occupied by its opposite. From this qualitatively new position, the proletariat can wield state power in the socialist transformation to eliminate exploitation, thereby eliminating the contradictions for the existence of both itself and the bourgeoisie as classes. One way to think about this is to say that identity is what holds things together. In other words, identity represents the real concrete relationships that bind these opposing forces to each other. In the case of the working class and capitalists, these are the real concrete relations of production. The capitalists own the means of production, and workers have to sell their labor to the capitalists to survive. Nevertheless, Lenin makes an important point here. The unity, coincidence, identity, equal action, of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, just as development and motion are absolute. This is crucial for revolutionaries to grasp. Struggle and change are both constant and necessary. So to sum up, identity is the concrete relationship between contradictory aspects. On the one hand, it means that the two aspects of a contradiction are interdependent. On the other hand, it means that they can change places between which aspect is principal and which is secondary. But what role does antagonism play in the identity and struggle of opposites? Mao says that antagonism is one form, but not the only form, of the struggle of opposites, in his essay on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. Mao divides contradictions into two categories: those between the masses of the people and the enemy, and those among the people themselves. Contradictions between the people and the enemy are antagonistic. Contradictions among the people are non-antagonistic. For example, under capitalist society, the contradiction between the capitalists and the working class is an antagonistic contradiction. The capitalists derive their wealth through the exploitation of the workers. They get rich from the surplus value produced by workers. That is, the difference between the value added by living labor and the amount the capitalists pay the workers for that labor power. Over the long run, the more wealth the capitalists accumulate, the less the workers are able to take home and pay, and vice versa. This means the material interests of these two classes are directly and irreconcilably opposed to one another. One benefits only at the expense of the other. But there also exist contradictions among the masses of the people themselves. These contradictions are not antagonistic, not irreconcilably opposed to one another. Non-antagonistic contradictions are resolved through a process of unity-criticism-unity. This is a peaceful and democratic method of resolving non-antagonistic contradictions that means starting from the desire for unity, resolving contradictions through criticism or struggle, and arriving at a new unity on a new basis. This is the way communists should seek to resolve contradictions among themselves and among the broad masses of the people. This brings to a close our preliminary discussion of the primary law of dialectics, the law of contradiction, which Engels calls the law of interpenetration of opposites. It is one of our most powerful and important theoretical tools and deserves serious and ongoing study, well beyond the limitations of these short articles. From here, we understand how contradiction operates well enough to proceed, and so in our next article, we will look more closely at how contradiction operates in the transformation of quantity into quality. On Identity and Antagonism and Contradiction, by J. Sykes, published by Fight Back News. The Leap from Quantity to Quality, by J. Sykes. Now that we've gone into some detail on contradiction, let's look at the question of the transformation of quantity into quality. In his book, Dialectics of Nature, Engels names three dialectical laws: the laws of the interpenetration of opposites, which we've already dealt with, the transformation of quantity into quality and vice versa, and the negation of the negation. However, it is noteworthy that Mao Zedong argues that contradiction is the primary law of dialectics. The other two laws are either merely an instance of the law of contradiction, in the case of the transformation of quantity into quality, or a metaphysical carryover of Hegelian idealism, in the case of the negation of the negation. It is worthwhile to examine this in some detail. Here, we'll look at the question of how qualitative leaps are in fact instances of the law of contradiction. In what way is the leap from quantity to quality actually an instance of the law of contradiction? Mao makes short work of this in his Talk on Questions of Philosophy, stating that the transformation of quantity into quality is simply a matter of the unity of opposites, quantity and quality. In fact, what takes place dialectically is that quantitative accumulation eventually causes a shift in the uneven development of contradictory forces, and the previously secondary aspect of a contradiction becomes primary or dominant within the process, manifesting as a qualitative leap. Metaphysical thinking would have it that change is only a change into quantity. This vulgar evolutionist approach to change fails to account for the dialectical leap from quantity to quality. Often this is expressed as a kind of reformism in the movements in which we work. Liberal reformists believe that we can create a just society through a series of incremental changes, and that revolution isn't actually necessary. Social democrats commit a similar error. They misunderstand the transformation of quantity into quality because they don't understand that it is a function of dialectical contradiction. They believe that if enough social democratic reforms are accumulated, then the capitalist state can be transformed into a socialist state without a proletarian revolution to overthrow the power of the bourgeoisie. These reformists misunderstand not only the place of antagonism in the class struggle, but also the way that principal and secondary aspects of contradiction exchange places. It isn't a question of the incremental accumulation of reforms, but of the accumulation of force, of power, that determines which aspect of a contradiction is dominant. What we actually see when we look at the history of social change over and over again is that a series of small changes eventually leads to a revolutionary leap, after which things are fundamentally different and the situation is qualitatively new. For example, we may see that a series of quantitative steps, such as increasing exploitation in our workplace, can build alongside workers' frustration. Workplace actions may build up in a quantitative way through meetings, leafleting, and the eventual move towards indirect shop floor tactics like slowdowns or work to rule. Eventually, the principal and secondary aspects of the contradiction at work change places, resulting in a qualitative leap into a direct confrontation between the workers and bosses and the workers' strike. As we have already seen in our study of contradiction, qualitative change occurs when the principal and secondary aspects of a contradiction change place. Look at this passage from Mao's essay on contradiction. But this situation is not static. The principal and the non-principal aspects of a contradiction transform themselves into each other, and the nature of the thing changes accordingly. In a given process, or at a given stage in the development of a contradiction, A is the principal aspect and B is the non-principal aspect. At another stage, or in another process, the roles are reversed, a change determined by the extent of the increase or decrease in the force of each aspect in its struggle against the other in the course of the development of a thing. Let's examine Mao's argument here by returning to our example of the workers' struggle. As the struggle progresses, the workers escalate their tactics, applying greater and greater pressure. Class struggle develops consciousness and organization, and the quantitative accumulation of these things leads to a qualitative leap in the struggle. The strike will be won or lost depending on the accumulation of force by the workers, and whether or not the workers have accumulated the force necessary to become the principal aspect of the contradiction in this particular struggle. That is, the dominant force in the process. If the workers haven't built up their forces, escalated their tactics step by step to raise the consciousness of the broad rank and file, and built their strike fund, then their relative lack of power will make it a difficult struggle to win. If this quantitative accumulation of force has taken place, however, then and only then is a qualitative leap possible, such that the workers become the dominant force in the process, and on that basis can seize the time, appropriately advance their tactics, and win the strike. So we see then the way in which dialectical materialism accounts for qualitative change. Mao is correct to say that the transformation of quantity into quality is an instance of the law of contradiction. In our next essay, we will examine the third law of dialectics as presented by Engels, the negation of the negation. The Leap from Quantity to Quality by J. Sykes, published by Fightback News. On the Negation of the Negation by J. Sykes. In our study of the three laws of dialectics presented by Engels, we've examined the law of contradiction and the law of the transformation of quantity into quality. Finally, Engels says that the third law of dialectics is the law of the negation of the negation. We have seen that Mao Zedong has argued that the law of contradiction is the primary law of dialectics. In our last article, we looked at how the transformation of quantity into quality was, in fact, an instance of the law of contradiction. Here, we will examine Mao's argument against the negation of the negation as a dialectical law. First, what does the negation of the negation mean? And why have Marxists thought of it as a worthwhile way to explain dialectical process? The concept comes from the most advanced philosophy of the time in which Marx and Engels were working, Hegel's dialectical idealism. It describes a process in a sequence of steps, starting with an affirmation, followed by a negation that arises as a result of that affirmation, and then followed by a negation of that negation. Hegel was talking about ideas, and so talked about this in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Engels makes use of this Hegelian language in referring to the negation of the negation as a dialectical law, but this has the potential to create some confusion among Marxists, that we would benefit from sorting out. Materialist dialectics is concerned with material reality, not just ideas. So to illustrate this sequence, let's consider capitalism as our first affirmation. Marx says the bourgeoisie creates its own gravediggers. In other words, bourgeois society creates its own negation, the proletariat, a class born out of capitalism itself. Capitalism itself gives rise to the necessity of socialist revolution. The proletariat, through socialist revolution, therefore negates the bourgeoisie, capitalist relations, and so on, step by step. But in doing so, the proletariat also eliminates the conditions for its own existence as a class. This is what Lenin describes in The State and Revolution as socialism's withering away, which allows for a stateless and classless society, communism, to come forth. This is the second negation, the negation of the negation, by this way of looking at it. Taken step by step, we see that first we have the original affirmation, the thesis. This is capitalism in our illustration. This is followed by an antithesis, which arises from and negates the original thesis. This is the first negation, socialism. Finally, we have the synthesis, which negates the antithesis that had negated the original thesis, communism. Thus, the final synthesis is the negation of the negation. Essentially, in this progression of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the final synthesis serves to negate the antithesis that itself negated the original thesis, while also preserving elements of both in a new unity or identity. In this process, the law of the negation is what accounts for the spiral development that makes progress, rather than mere repetition, possible. This synthesis carries forward something from both the original affirmation and the first negation, synthesizing them, that is, uniting them, into something qualitatively new. This new unity becomes a new thesis, or a new affirmation, and the sequence begins again, but at a higher level than before. This conception of the dialectic accounts for progress by describing how this step-by-step process leads from one thing to the next, based on resolving the contradictions that arise from the process. Of course, this isn't entirely incorrect, but it is inaccurate. This inaccuracy can lead to some confusion as to what is really taking place, dialectically. The law of the negation is helpful to a point, but we have to go further. Revolutionary science can't rest within simple explanations. The thinking behind the law of the negation confuses the issue in two interrelated ways. First, it gives too linear an understanding of dialectics, which doesn't account for the complex processes where multiple contradictions are at work at the same time, which we've described in our articles on contradiction. And second, by starting and ending with identity, it enshrines identity, or unity, as primary over contradiction or struggle. To truly put the dialectic on a materialist basis also means, as Mao says in his talk on questions of philosophy, to understand that every link in the chain of events is both affirmation and negation. In other words, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis aren't separated from each other in a metaphysical way. Affirmation and negation are present at every moment of any given process. In his essay on contradiction, Mao made a great contribution to the Marxist-Leninist philosophy of dialectical materialism by clearly explaining that the materialist dialectic cannot be understood as a simple, linear sequence, but as a complex structural matrix of many unevenly developed contradictions, all at work simultaneously. It is important to note that if we ignore the complexity of contradiction in favor of a simple, linear sequence, we risk taking a mechanical approach to solving problems by failing to recognize the significance of secondary contradictions in the situation. People who claim that everything that isn't pure class struggle is a distraction are guilty of this error. Furthermore, the law of the negation preserves a Hegelian metaphysical framework. The Hegelian dialectic begins and ends with identity, mediated by struggle. The first identity is the thesis of Hegel's triad, the original affirmation, and the Hegelian synthesis, the negation of the negation, is a new identity, with struggle, antithesis, acting merely as a bridge between them. This is an important point. In the Hegelian sequence, contradiction exists primarily between identities rather than within them. Here, identity is absolute and struggle is relative. In reality, on the contrary, contradiction is present within and essential to every moment of the process. Bourgeois society contains a multitude of contradictions, affirmations, and negations, as does socialism, and so will communism. Struggle is inherent in every part of the process. Every identity is teeming with contradictions. If we don't grasp this point, we will think that external contradictions should be the focus of our attention, rather than internal contradictions that tend to drive things forward. The law of contradiction, as Marxism-Leninism understands it, means that the main thing in dialectics is division, rather than identity. To sum this up, the Chinese revolutionaries put forward the slogan, "One divides into two," against the Hegelian, "Two fuses into one," emphasizing the primary place of contradiction. Struggle isn't just a bridge between the old identity and the new. No, in fact, identity without contradiction cannot exist. Everything divides into two. This may seem like an overly philosophical point, but it is important for revolutionaries to grasp to avoid errors based in metaphysical thinking. The law of the negation would have it that dialectics is a continuous movement towards unity or synthesis. Mao Zedong argues, on the contrary, that life of dialectics is the continuous movement towards opposites. The Hegelian sequence leaves us with a dialectic that sees unity as absolute and contradiction as relative, temporary, and conditional. On the contrary, affirmation and negation exist within every moment of every process. Contradictions exist within the very essence of things, not just between them. And it is those internal contradictions that are the primary motivators of change. Qualitative change doesn't result from a drive towards synthesis, but from the transformation of the principal and secondary aspects of a contradiction into their opposites. It isn't by uniting two contradictory things that we make historical progress, but by dividing them. We don't make socialist revolution by uniting with the bourgeoisie. It is true that socialism carries forward elements of capitalist relations of production in the transition to communism. But the main thing isn't to preserve those elements, but to destroy and uproot them piece by piece. Qualitative change results from the quantitative accumulation of force, which changes the balance of power. In privileging identity over struggle, the law of the negation can also put Marxists at risk of a kind of fatalism, where communism exists as the final cause at the end of history, drawing everything towards it as the final identity where everything is ultimately resolved. Communism isn't a final identity without any contradictions. Contradictions will exist within communism as well. Change and progress will continue. History will never end. Again, the law of the negation is useful to a point, but if we don't take it further, we are left open to metaphysical errors. It gives us too linear a description of the dialectical process, and it separates affirmation and negation in a metaphysical way that privileges identity. As Marxism-Leninism has advanced, it has advanced the philosophy of dialectical materialism beyond the metaphysical, linear framework of Hegelianism. Mao accomplished this by theorizing the concepts of the principal contradiction, principal and secondary aspects of contradictions, and the uneven development of contradictions within a process. Mao's writings on dialectical materialism give us a powerful weapon to analyze the forces at work in the complex processes we face. Next in our series, we'll look at how these processes shape history. In the following articles, we'll look at the categories and concepts of the materialist conception of history, that is, historical materialism, and what they offer Marxist-Leninists as theoretical tools for changing the world. On the Negation of the Negation, by Jay Sykes, published by Fightback News. Marxism Against Pragmatism, by Jay Sykes. Marxist-Leninists are practical people. This has been true since Marx wrote his famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. Many Marxists might even consider themselves pragmatists, but Marxism and pragmatism, though there may be some superficial similarities, are, in fact, fundamentally opposed. So let's look more closely at this. What is pragmatism? To be a pragmatist means a lot more than just being a practically oriented person concerned with organizing. Pragmatism is a philosophy born in the 19th century in the United States that basically says whatever is useful is true. Ultimately, it is a methodology rooted in subjective idealism. Subjective idealism says that only our minds and mental conceptions exist. Things only exist to the extent that they are perceived. This subjective idealism is the starting point of pragmatism. For the pragmatist, there is no shared, objective, material reality with universal laws. Nothing is objectively true, but only becomes true through the subjective act of inquiry. Because objective truth and necessity are inaccessible at best, any claim to objective truth gives way to whatever is useful to believe. In the 1870s, pragmatism originated from a group in the United States called the Metaphysical Club, which included many prominent professors in the fields of philosophy, psychology, law, and theology. Charles Peirce, Oliver Wendell Holmes, John Fiske, and William James were the most notable pragmatists to come from this club, with John Dewey coming later. Pragmatism in practice generally leads to a kind of eclecticism, taking a bit of this and a bit of that, mixed together in whatever combination is considered useful. Thus, many who have called themselves pragmatists have held a range of views. But for now, let's focus on the point common to all of them, the idea that what is true is whatever works for the pragmatist. William James called this the instrumental view of truth, or truth's cash value. An obvious objection to this is that some truths may in fact be useless, but nonetheless true. Likewise, it is very clear that unscrupulous people often find falsehoods to be very useful. But that only makes sense if we accept that there is an objective reality independent of our subjective experiences and beliefs. This is no problem for the pragmatists who care only about expediency, only what serves self-interest. They can't be bothered by objectivity. The pragmatist is satisfied with whatever is useful for them to believe. All that matters is what gets the job done. We see that when pragmatism says that whatever is useful is true, this begs the question, useful to whom and for what? For the capitalist ruling class, of course, the job just so happens to be whatever keeps capitalism running smoothly and efficiently. If we look at things from the point of view of historical materialism, we see that the mode of production of society gives rise to a dominant ideology that reinforces it. Every mode of thinking is stamped by the brand of a class, and pragmatism is no exception. Pragmatism arose after the Civil War had swept away the slave economy of the South and consolidated the power of northern industrial capital over the country. This was also the period when competitive capitalism was giving way to monopoly capitalism. Religious philosophy and theology were no longer sufficient as ideological weapons of the bourgeoisie. Pragmatism arose to take up this role and became the dominant philosophical expression of the ideology of imperialism and the monopoly capitalist class. Old, traditional ways of thinking were being swept away, and whatever works became the motto of the monopolies as they devoured the economy and set out to seize markets the world over. In the terrain of the capitalist superstructure, the ideology of the ruling class is dominant, and proletarian ideology is secondary. This means capitalist ideology is always exerting pressure upon our thinking. Since the dominant ideology in the superstructure reinforces the economic base, if we don't challenge pragmatist ideology, it is easy to allow it to weasel its way into our thinking and methodology where it can undermine our practice. Harry K. Wells, in his book Pragmatism, Philosophy of Imperialism, identifies 4 features of pragmatism as a methodology: empiricism, individualism, spontaneity, and expedient opportunism. It is important to look at each of these and see how even well-intentioned revolutionaries can make these errors and how one leads to the next. Beginning with empiricism, pragmatism goes all in on practice and despises theory. Pragmatism holds that reality is nothing but our perceptions, and so we can only know what we have directly observed and experienced. It rejects any claim that we can draw universally applicable theoretical lessons from our experiences. Instead, it advocates pluralism and relativism. In other words, what is useful and therefore true for me may not be for you. Therefore, individualism is an obvious outgrowth of this. Since pragmatism thinks only our direct perceptions give us access to knowledge, we are left only with our unique, particular individual experiences. Thus, pragmatism rejects social practice, collective summation, and organizational discipline, especially when they don't align with our individual experiences. Strategic unity of action becomes unthinkable. From there, spontaneity takes the place of planning and strategy. The dialectical relationship between theory and practice is broken, and the focus is narrowed to only the local, immediate work. Long-term goals are sacrificed for the pragmatic demands of our day-to-day work. Instead of working with a plan, we're now just doing things, focused on whatever works for the task at hand. This spontaneity fits perfectly with the capitalist anarchy of production. Finally, pragmatism leads us to expedient opportunism. This view holds that it doesn't matter if we adhere to our principles as long as we get results. Without an analysis built upon the laws of dialectical and historical materialism, and without a sense of historical progress, there is nothing to prevent pragmatism from transforming Marxism into opportunism, as Marxist principles are compromised for whatever works. But to oppose principles to results is a false dichotomy, of course. And it is actually one that sets us up for failure. Our Marxist-Leninist principles are truly the key to our success. Let's look at an example of how this could play out. A revolutionary in the labor movement may correctly say that the immediate tasks of organizing are important, but incorrectly say that the long-term task of party building and winning over the advanced workers from these labor struggles to Marxism isn't practical. They do the hard work of organizing, but intentionally avoid talking to their co-workers about Marxism. Certainly, our work should aim to win all that can be won and strike blows against the enemy. But if we aren't building revolutionary organization and winning the advance to Marxism-Leninism, then we are sacrificing our long-term goals for the immediate tasks in the name of being pragmatic. Similarly, because they think it is expedient, they may make concessions on matters of principle in order to build broad unity, tailing behind the backwards. Such an approach concedes leadership to these backwards elements. Instead, revolutionaries should be relying upon the advanced forces to help win over and mobilize the intermediate masses and challenge backwards ideas. In this way, pragmatism is a right opportunist error, and often it is an error made with the best of intentions. We want to get things done, after all, but left unchecked, whatever works can lead us to abandon revolutionary theory, to abandon revolutionary organization, to abandon our long-term goals, and to abandon our principles. Marxism does not agree with pragmatism. When Marxists say that practice is the sole criterion of truth, we don't mean that theory should be set aside. We mean that through social practice, we can know the world and understand its laws of motion. We can study the laws that govern material processes and formulate strategies and tactics with a long-term view. We can use that knowledge to change the world for the better through further practice. This is the only way to revolutionize society and eliminate exploitation and oppression once and for all. Marxism Against Pragmatism by Jay Sykes, circulated by Fight Back News. Marxism Against Postmodernism by Jay Sykes. In the ideological terrain today, Marxism must struggle against postmodernism. What is postmodernism? In The Postmodern Condition, the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard summed up the postmodern view as the rejection of meta-narratives. By meta-narratives, Lyotard means any theory that claims to be able to explain the totality of social, historical, and cultural phenomena. This includes the Enlightenment and Marxism. In other words, postmodernism opposes the idea that the world can or should be objectively and rationally understood. The idea that the world as a whole is rational and comprehensible is thus deemed modern, and postmodernism claims to have gone beyond modernism. Because it is opposed to these kinds of totalizing discourse, postmodernism can be hard to pin down, It concerns itself with literary theory, art, and architecture, and similar culture, ideological and superstructural ideas. These aren't unimportant questions for revolutionaries to grasp, and, indeed, Marxism can and should address them. Postmodernism also deals with political questions, but it does so based on theories of difference and power that are separate from and opposed to any notions of class struggle. Here, postmodernism's main theorists have been Jacques Derrida and Michael Foucault, among others. And while some of the far right would equate postmodernism with Marxism, they do so only to confuse people. Postmodernism and Marxism are fundamentally opposed to one another. Let's begin with how postmodernism arose, ideologically, and why. There are two events that are of particular importance. First, the horror of the Second World War, and second, the Cold War and the collapse of socialism in the USSR and Eastern Europe. First, in the aftermath of World War II, many philosophers in Europe took the view that it was rationalism and Enlightenment thinking itself that led to the rise of fascism and the Holocaust. They correctly understood that fascism is an outgrowth of capitalism, but they also bought into the rampant anti-communism of the period and so saw no alternative way forward. They accepted the liberal bourgeois lie that fascism and communism were two sides of one totalitarian coin. Then, from the end of the war through the 1980s, we have the Cold War, culminating in the restoration of capitalism in the Soviet Union in 1991 after decades of external imperialist pressure and internal revisionist degeneration. The postmodernists accepted the neoliberal lie that there is no alternative to capitalism. This fundamental pessimism arose from the failure to correctly analyze these historical events, and it led to the rejection, whole cloth, that reason could comprehend history and be used to drive social progress. This confusion was no accident, however. Postmodernism was, in fact, a CIA psychological operation. In her book, Who Paid the Piper? The CIA in the Cultural Cold War, Frances Stonor Saunders exposes the role of U.S. intelligence in founding and encouraging postmodernism. They spent millions of dollars promoting front organizations, museum exhibitions, literary and theoretical magazines, and other cultural fronts to promote postmodern ideas. They realized that they could further exacerbate and exploit the confusion within the left that was created by Nikita Khrushchev's revisionist attack at the 20th Congress of the CPSU on Stalin. In this way, they were able to turn a lot of influential intellectuals away from Marxism. Imperialism pursued this cultural Cold War as part of a two-pronged strategy, while simultaneously financing and organizing counter-revolutionary movements, from the counter-revolutions in socialist Eastern Europe to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. In this way, postmodernism was an essential element and outgrowth of the imperialist overall Cold War strategy against communism. Today, postmodern ideas are still tremendously influential, even among some on the left. Some further confuse people by calling themselves post-Marxists or neo-Marxists. They thus try to insert postmodernism into Marxism while actually rejecting and opposing Marxism. Postmodern theory is notoriously dense and academic, so we won't get into the weeds of all that here. Instead, let's break down a few of the points that linger among the broader left. The central point is the rejection of rationality in favor of relativism and subjective idealism. For the postmodernist, truth is relative, contingent, subjective, and based upon language and discourse rather than objective material conditions. As stated in postmodernism today, postmodernism spreads a linguistic net to destroy the basis of all rational understanding and all experiences attained over centuries by mankind, and arrogantly declares that we and our thoughts are the creations of language. Postmodernism seeks to discredit Marxism by saying that any rational theory that attempts to understand and account for all social, historical, and cultural phenomena is destined for totalitarianism. It therefore champions the isolation and balkanization of all criticism of the current social order. Because meta-narratives are rejected, every question is separated off into its own discourse. Every form of oppression is isolated from the dialectical material relationships they have to one another in a metaphysical and idealist way. And while each of these makes progressive contributions that we can learn from, their strategic power is stripped away. Because they are isolated from one another in theory and practice, they are unable to develop a comprehensive program to address the principal contradiction of capitalism at the root of patriarchy and racist national oppression. Intersectional attempts to bridge this gap fail in the same way, by seeing class exploitation as just another form of oppression among many, as the materialist reality of capitalism that ties oppression together is rejected. Attempts to define principal and secondary contradictions are discarded as reductionist. But without grasping which contradiction is the principal contradiction that determines the others, none of them can be fundamentally resolved. As Anuradha Gandhi says in her important book, Philosophical Trends in the Feminist Movement, to advocate organization according to the postmodernist understanding means to reduce power, hierarchy, oppression. Struggle is individualized, and so subjective experience rather than objective analysis takes over. In the final analysis, this metaphysical approach leads to confusion of who are our friends and who are our enemies. Without a dialectical and historical class analysis, postmodernism fails to resist the ideological pressure of ruling class interests within oppressed groups. In this way, the postmodernist rejection of meta-narratives in favor of difference hinders and obstructs the Marxist analysis necessary to unite these movements behind a strategic program for revolution, liberation, and socialism. We are Marxist-Leninists because we understand that Marxism-Leninism can provide us with the theoretical analysis, strategy, and tactics needed to end the exploitation and oppression of all people. Marxism has the tools that are required for women's liberation, LGBTQ liberation, and national liberation in the real world. Postmodernism is designed to fragment and isolate these struggles. We can and must unite them under the bright red banner of socialist revolution. Marxism Against Postmodernism by Jay Sykes, published by Fight Back News. What is historical materialism? By Jay Sykes. Now that we have talked about the Marxist theory of knowledge and examined the meaning and function of dialectical materialism, let's look at how this is applied to studying the historical development of society. Marx called this the materialist conception of history, or historical materialism. It is historical materialism that demonstrates the link between dialectical materialism and political economy. Here we have dialectical materialism applied to history. Before we get into all the details of historical materialism, let's take an introductory look at some of the key concepts. This way we can understand how they fit together. After this, we can look more closely at them each, piece by piece. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels famously proclaimed that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. This is the main point of historical materialism, but there is a lot to unpack in that statement, and we should spend some time understanding how Marx and Engels arrived at that conclusion and what it means for revolutionaries. Engels summed it up like this: just as Darwin discovered the law of development of organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history. The simple fact, hitherto concealed by an overgrowth of ideology, that mankind must first of all eat, drink, have shelter and clothing, before it can pursue politics, science, art, religion, etc. That therefore the production of the immediate material means, and consequently the degree of economic development attained by a given people or during a given epoch, form the foundation upon which the state institutions, the legal conceptions, art, and even the ideas on religion of the people concerned have been evolved, and in the light of which they must, therefore, be explained, instead of vice versa, as had hitherto been the case. As we've said before, Marxism is monastic rather than dualistic, meaning it doesn't separate matter and thought, but recognizes thought as arising from and dependent upon matter. Our material being determines our consciousness. Before we can think, we must eat. Basically, Marxism understands that human society has always been organized around its tools in the production of its material needs. Each historical period is characterized materially by its forces of production and relations of production. Together, these make up the material and economic base of society, the mode of production. Forces of production include everything we use to fulfill human needs. This includes everything from tools to factories, alongside land, raw materials, logistical infrastructure, warehouses, offices, retail facilities, restaurants, and so on. The tools and factories make up the instruments of production. The raw materials and resources make up the objects of production. The means of production consist of the instruments and objects of production together. The forces of production also include the living labor of the workers, the agents of production. In early human society, these productive forces were limited mainly to things like stone arrowheads and spear tips for hunting. Now they include highly complex technologies and methods. Relations of production are the definite social relations that people enter into in order to organize the production of their needs. Production is a social process, based on some degree of a division of labor, and, following the end of primitive communal societies and the rise of the ancient slave societies, division of ownership, or class division. In class society, the means of production and the agents of production are separated, such that a minority of people own the means of production, while a much larger majority of people work as the agents of production. For now, let's just emphasize that in the contradiction between the forces and relations of production, the forces of production tend to be the principal or determining aspect. It is the forces of production, that is, the instruments of production together with living labor, acting upon nature, that plays the leading role. However, at times the relations of production may be the principal aspect, hastening or slowing the development of the productive forces. Corresponding to this economic and material base of society, there is also a superstructure of society, made up of a set of repressive and ideological apparatuses whose function is the reproduction of the mode of production. This includes legal systems, the courts and the police, but it also includes cultural institutions, schools, the media, religion, and the broad political and philosophical ideas that characterize society. For now, let's just emphasize that in the contradiction between the base and superstructure, the base is typically the principal aspect. The superstructure arises from the material base, though the superstructure also acts upon the base and reinforces it. Each historical mode of production is defined by the level of the development of its productive forces and the corresponding relations of production. As the productive forces develop to higher levels, eventually the relations of production that at first encouraged and accelerated their development begin to hold them back, and those relations of production must be changed in order for the productive forces to be able to develop further. Marx sums this up most succinctly in his preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead sooner or later to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. As society's productive forces developed, so too did the relations of production develop from primitive communalism to the ancient slave societies, and on to feudalism, then capitalism, and from capitalism to socialism. These are the relations of production Marx and Engels identified from their analysis of how they had developed in Europe and how they would continue to develop based on their laws of motion that they drew from that analysis. Each change from one mode of production to the next meant the advancement of the productive forces and the revolutionizing of the relations of production. These changes also created great shifts in the legal, political, and ideological superstructure to reinforce the base, demanding changes in legal structures, education, family relations, and so on. Historical materialism exposes the great lie of bourgeois ideology, that capitalism is eternal. It shows us that, on the contrary, it wasn't always like this, that things have come to be this way as a result of a historical process, and that we can and must change things fundamentally and for the better. Historical materialism is a vast subject, and it will take us some time to do it justice. This article could only serve as a brief introduction to the elements of historical materialism. In our forthcoming articles, we will go more deeply into each of these. What is Historical Materialism? By Jay Sykes, published by Fightback News. The Role of Labor in the Development of Human Society, by Jay Sykes. The cornerstone of historical materialism is class struggle as the motor driving historical change. So what is the role of labor in historical development? In Dialectics of Nature, Engels argues that what truly distinguishes humanity from other animals is that we seek to change our environment, rather than merely use it as it is given to us. In other words, what distinguishes humanity is our construction of tools, the instruments of production, which we use to affect the world. But we don't get to arbitrarily choose these instruments. We inherit them from the society that we are born into, and gradually build upon and improve them. The early production of tools represents the beginning of labor, and the further development and improvement of the tools and the techniques of their use allows for the further development of human society. At first, the instruments of production were very simple and consisted of things like hunting and fishing implements. According to Engels, this led to the mastery of fire and the early domestication of animals. Agriculture was added to hunting and cattle raising. Then came spinning, weaving, metalworking, pottery, and navigation. Along with trade and industry, art and science finally appeared. Tribes developed into nations and states. Law and politics arose, and with them that fantastic reflection of human things in the human mind, religion. Engels argues that the dominant conception of history privileges the working of the mind rather than the work of laboring hands because of the division that arose between mental and manual labor. The mind that planned the labor was able, at a very early stage in the development of society, for example, already in the primitive family, to have the labor that had been planned carried out by other hands than its own. Thus, social progress was deceptively ascribed to the function of the ideas of great thinkers, instead of to our material activity and production. It wasn't until Marx and Engels developed their materialist conception of history that this misconception of historical development was corrected. It isn't the ideas of great thinkers that play the primary role in changing the material world, but the material world and our activity in it that shapes our ideas. This division between mental and manual labor is important, and the various divisions of labor generally are a cornerstone of how labor functions in history. We'll talk more about this division of labor later, but for now, let's emphasize that we are talking about the separation and specialization of tasks and production. In the German ideology, Marx and Engels write, how far the productive forces of a nation are developed is shown most manifestly by the degree to which the division of labor has been carried. In other words, the more advanced the productive forces, the more complex the division of labor. Early forms of human society had relatively simple productive forces. Because the productive forces were not very advanced, they did not require an advanced division of labor. As the productive forces were developed further and they became more and more complex, so too did the division of labor become more complex. But this division of labor is also the source of the development of classes. As Marx and Engels put it, the various stages of development in the division of labor are just so many different forms of ownership, i.e., the existing stage in the division of labor determines also the relations of individuals to one another with reference to the material, instruments, and product of labor. The division of labor leads at a certain point to the means of production, that is, the instrument and objects of labor, i.e., the tools and natural resources, being separated from those who do the work, as the ownership of the means of production are concentrated in the hands of only a few members of society. With capitalism, the division of labor is extremely complex, and the contradiction between social production and private accumulation at the heart of it leads to ever-deepening crises of overproduction and ever-sharpening class antagonism between the capitalists and the workers. The only way forward is proletarian revolution. This brings us to a crucial point, the decisive role of the masses in history. Mao Zedong put it succinctly when he said, "The people, and the people alone, are the motive force in the making of world history." Within the forces of production themselves, as the agents of production who wield the instruments of production, the masses play the decisive role. And likewise, when the relations of production become decisive over the productive forces, that is, when they become fetters on their further advancement and a revolutionary situation is at hand, then too, the conscious activity of the masses plays a decisive role. Che Guevara said this another way: the revolution is not an apple that falls when it is ripe. You have to make it fall. Therefore, Marxist-Leninists must understand that the most important aspect of their work is organizational, ideological, and educational work, utilizing the mass line among working and oppressed people for the overthrow of capitalism and imperialism. Whenever the relations of production hinder the development of the productive forces, an economic crisis results. The economic crisis itself isn't enough to change society. The exploited classes must fight to revolutionize the relations of production, that is, the class relations of society. When a capitalist crisis intensifies, the economic crisis will become a political crisis when the working class realizes that it cannot live in the old way, and the ruling class realizes it can no longer rule in the old way. But in order to take advantage of this revolutionary moment, working and oppressed people must develop their class consciousness and organization. This means building a new Marxist-Leninist Communist Party, capable of leading unions and mass organizations, and developing the united front against monopoly capitalism with the strategic alliance of the multinational working class and oppressed nationalities at its core. Only this way can we seize the time. This is the essence of the role of labor in human history. We work to fulfill our material needs, creating and developing tools to help us change the world around us. As our tools and the techniques with which we wield them become more advanced, so too must our division of labor advance to match. Class struggle follows from this basic materialist fact. The symbol of communism is the hammer and the sickle because these are the tools of the workers and the peasants. The tools that built the old society, the weapons that will dismantle it, and the tools that will build the new society. This is the historic mission of the working class, to overthrow capitalism, and by building socialism, to end all exploitation. The Role of Labor in the Development of Human Society by J. Sykes, published by Fightback News. The Role of the Forces of Production by J. Sykes. Up to now, we have studied dialectical materialism and given a general overview of its application to history, historical materialism. Now, let's look more closely at some of the core concepts that make up Marxism's materialist conception of history, starting with the forces of production. Any social system, whether we are talking about capitalism, socialism, feudalism, or what have you, has a particular mode of production upon which it is based. What do we mean by a mode of production? Simply put, it is a way of producing. A mode of production is the historically constituted way in which production is carried out. The mode of production is a complex structure made up of two contradictory aspects, the forces of production and the relations of production. Here, let's look closely at the forces of production, what they consist of, and the role they play in this contradiction. Fundamentally, the forces of production consist of the agents of production on the one hand and the means of production on the other. The means of production consist of the instruments of production, that is, the tools, factories, and so on, along with the objects of production, that is, the raw material and natural resources that are transformed through the labor process into goods. The agents of production are the workers themselves, who work to transform the objects of production, raw materials, etc., through their use of the instruments of production, tools, equipment, etc. The main thing is the people. Without their labor, the hammers don't hammer, the machines don't run, and the fruits and vegetables spoil in the fields. Each mode of production has productive forces that are unique to that historical mode, and that have come to exist historically as a result of what came before it. The productive forces don't appear out of thin air, but are built upon the productive forces that preceded them. This means that we can't jump around, just as we couldn't have simply decided to develop steel without first having learned to smelt iron. Why is the development of the productive forces important? Basically, the productive forces coincide with the productive capacity of society.